Hello and welcome to Scholars in a Bar. We meet again because bars aren't really fully functioning yet in one of our homes. And with me is, as usual, Dr. Al Eichelman. And our guest today is Caroline Giepert, who is a Master of Art History from Louisiana State University and currently works as the manager of the Vina Gallery in the French Quarter of New Orleans.
Thank you all for having me today. Very happy to be here in our homemade bar.
The topic we have today is on the Dada movement of art and the American, although she was an immigrant, the American queen of the Dada movement. What are we talking about? And maybe you should first tell us what this type of art is, because quite frankly, I'd never heard of it before we started.
Basically Dada at its core was founded originally in Switzerland by Tristan Tzara, was kind of the first founder writer about it. The big names today, of course, are Marcel Duchamp, Man Ray, but it was basically founded kind of as a counter against World War I, because with, the state of Europe at that time, Dada was kind of rebelling against that and wanted to be much more lighthearted. We'll talk about some pieces later. You can see it's very iconoclastic, rebelling against the notion of fine art institutions, really begs the question of what is art? Is this considered art? What they're most famous for today is ready-mades, which are basically just either assemblage pieces or just pretty much just junk that they found that they decided, slap a title on it, call it art, put a concept behind it. So what you see Dada influences later on is conceptual art, more contemporary movements like that came along in the 40s and 50s. Again, like I said, it was rebelling against World War I, so Dada started in the early 19,000s to kind of the 19-teens.
All right, so is it before World War I?
Yeah, exactly. It kind of started before World War I was taking place and then led into it. It's hard to put an exact date on it, but I'd say about 1911, 12. I believe 1912 was when you see Duchamp and Tzara kind of sit down together. They created, I believe it's the Société Anonyme. You're the French speaker, Al. I don't know if you could help, but it was anonymous societies. Kind of this salon they started in Paris where they started talking about these ideas. The ideas then spread to Germany, and eventually we see it land in America in about 1913, 1914.
Would you say that Duchamp and company, that they were representatives of a kind of protest art? Would you call it that or not?
I think definitely, and when we start to talk more about the lady we'll be talking about today, we'll see she heavily was protesting what we would think of, and then what they would think of as, the fine arts, like fine gallery exhibitions, opera, that type of stuff. So I think definitely they were rebelling against that idea of institutionalized art and trying to pave their own way. It's very much the avant-garde.
Would that be more of a, how shall I put it? Would that be more out there or offensive, say, in America than even Europe?
I think at the time, more offensive in Europe.
Really?
Because at least to put ourselves in the Dada's mindset, a lot of them kind of looked down on America. They thought that America was not as established in the fine arts at the time. They were not as culturally sophisticated. So I think in their mind, they saw America as almost this new playground to come kind of mess around in and spread their new ideas. Whereas in Europe, fine arts were much longer established. And so I think they saw it more.
Well, I know at that particular period of time, Americans did still look to Europe in terms of how you say it, having their bona fides, getting kind of their, if they could claim something was European, or they were European, or they could glom onto European royalty or whatever, that was a big deal in America back in the late 19th and early 20th century in particular. That expressed itself in so many different ways.
Would you say it's different among other classes, though? Because we'll see part of where Dada really took root in New York was kind of a mixture of both intellectuals that were kind of part of the higher class as well as working class. Yeah. And so I think Dada took a lot of their, as far as American Dada, took a lot of its inspiration from working class as well.
The Dada, though, it's not just sculpture and painting. It seemed to be a performing arts as well.
Performance arts. There's even Dada poetry is its whole own collection. The sculptures would be kind of the ready-mades. Really, it's hard to really pin down Dada painting, but Dada was, yes, very performative. Man Ray specifically specialized in Dada photography, which was kind of went along with performances. So actually one performance Baroness did, Man Ray was the videographer / photographer for it. So I think the photography performances kind of went hand in hand. It was all encompassing, assemblages, sculpture.
So it was kind of what the Germans refer to as Gesamtkunstwerk, the universal art, or the combination of different expressions of art, Gesamtkunstwerk.
I think they felt about it that way, because you'll also see a lot of Dada artists didn't see it as just an art. They truly saw it as a way of life. Like, it was a lifestyle. It wasn't just what you made. You acted Dada. You were Dada.
And the idea, was it to provoke any particular emotion from the audience, or?
I think it was, like we were saying, rebellious. So I think if anything, they wanted to kind of agitate. So they were expecting, and I think almost wanted, negative reactions. But also at the same, Dada, it's, and you'll see really with American Dada, it's very playful. As opposed, European Dada was much more kind of cool, detached. American Dada is very playful. So I think they were telling people to not be so serious, but especially people, and again, we'll talk more about their counter performances to opera and stuff. I think they were expecting people to react negatively as far as people that were more in tune with that fine arts class, like intellectuals like that. I think they were expecting them to.
Being from New Orleans, as you are speaking, it reminds me of something that we are all, I think, very familiar with, and I'd like to have you speak to it. And that is a way in which this is still with us and still alive, and that is in the Crew de Vue. Now, many of our listeners probably aren't aware of the Crew de Vue, but maybe, am I correct when I say that?
I actually think that is a perfect connection that, I've never truly thought about myself, but that very playful take on life. Dada, you don't really see them getting involved with politics, which Crew de Vue is, again, if you're not from here, you might not be aware. It's a lot of political commentary, a lot of political satire, but definitely the satire aspect of it. And also, Dada focused a lot on just sexuality and also gender bending. And you do see drag in Crew de Vue. You see lots of different sexual anatomy, and you saw that same thing in Dada.
You put that very delicately. Thank you.
We're scholars. Just because we're in a bar, we're still scholars. So I'll try to give a brief background, because her background is important to kind of how she performed in America. So Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, she was born Elsa Platz in a small port town in northern Germany on the Baltic Sea. She came from a very bad family life, so she does kind of follow that artistic trope of the suffering artist. Her father was relentlessly strict. Her mother had severe depression, actually attempted suicide, and was institutionalized. And her father remarried. She got along horribly with them. Her father ended up choking her, and she immediately just packed up and left to stay with an aunt in Berlin. Berlin's important because that's where she truly was exposed to the art world there, much more cosmopolitan lifestyle than she was used to. She kind of began experimenting sexually. She had several relationships with both men and women. That's where she got into theater and performance. She was in a play called Living Pictures. It was actually a series of plays that just reenacted different Greek mythologies. So she had to be nude on stage, and we'll see that come up. She does a lot of performance art where she's either nude or scantily clad, so she was very comfortable with her body. So we see all this happen in Berlin. How she finally came to America was on her third husband, Felix Grieve, had serious debt, was facing imprisonment. So she helped him stage his own suicide, and they fled to Kentucky. I was not able to find why they chose Kentucky, but of course, after living this cosmopolitan lifestyle in Berlin, she was not equipped for life in Kentucky. So their marriage quickly dissolved, and she arrived in New York in 1913, which coincidentally was the same year as the massive Armory show in New York, which scholars today kind of herald as the, arrival of modern avant-garde art in America. This was a massive show. It was in the National Guard Armory. That's why they just call it the Armory show now. So yeah, it's just kind of coincident that she arrived that same year. And she took up residence in Greenwich Village, which was kind of this hotbed for political and societal unrest. At this time, we have women marching for voting rights, for equality, also again for sexual liberation and independence. And I think the Elsa at this time just fit in perfectly there. She was a very independent spirit, kind of called like an aggressive woman at that time. And she ended up getting a studio apartment in the village, and she kind of turned that into her own workspace and her own art collection. And she became a known figure around the neighborhood.
So she went there with no contacts in New York, not knowing anyone, no source of income, and just was a pioneer, an adventurer.
Exactly. And once there was when she met her fourth and final husband, the Baron Leopold von Freytag-Loringhoven. So that's where she got her title. However, title only, no money. So they were still struggling. Very soon after they married, he returned to Europe. He fought in World War I, and he never returned. Mixed claims about whether he just left her or he may have actually committed suicide. So the Baroness was left struggling on her own. She worked odd factory jobs. She at one point was in a cigarette factory where she got 2 of her teeth knocked out. But she also tried to have modeling jobs. So this is a lady who doesn't have 2 of her teeth, and she's trying to model in New York. And also by other accounts, and there are some pictures of her, you can see she was not by any means the most attractive woman. And at this point she was, she was, I think, in her late 30s, heading early 40s at this point. So yeah, but she was just working any odd job she could.
It's interesting because it seems like she embraced the title Von, even though she started out as a Plotz, and that's quite a distinction. And it would seem to me it's almost a contradiction, because she's trying to eschew those sorts of things, and yet here she is embracing her title as a baroness, even though that's the exact opposite of what you would expect from someone who is involved in this kind of artistic movement. Did you find that there was this kind of contradiction quite a bit within Dada?
Oh, absolutely, and especially with the Baroness. I think her whole life was a juxtaposition, because yeah, she had this title which kind of lent her this air of haughtiness. So, but at the same time, she's living broke, and I wish I could remember which artist it was, but an artist at the time wrote an account of visiting her apartment and said she had 12 dogs. It smelled terrible. Her art collection, it wasn't a collection. She was just a hoarder that just picked junk up off the street. So yeah, she was so proud to have the title Baroness, but was by no means living like a Baroness. And also like flaunting her title, but at the same time focusing on lowbrow culture. But at the same time, like, she's critiquing America for... She would constantly critique America and did end up moving back to Europe because she missed the old world. She thought the old world culture was the culture, the sophistication. But we see that she's not really a sophisticated lady. So it's very... that, like I said, she is just a walking juxtaposition.
Has there been any discussion as to whether she was a true artist or just plain crazy or an authentic crazy artist?
There's been a lot of discussion on that because so we know her mother suffered from depression, and we know that depression and anxiety can be partially hereditary. So there was that talk. She also, while in Berlin, contracted syphilis and gonorrhea. So there was talk that maybe that led to other mental health issues as well. So a lot of people, and even just at the time and still today, write her off as just crazy. So some people, do not see her as an artist. They just think she was kind of this crazy lady parading around Greenwich Village.
Did she have any kind of formal training, or was she totally self-taught?
Totally self-taught, no type of formal training. Like I said, she kind of just was exposed to it once she moved to Berlin. I'd say the most formal training she had was working with the theater that she worked with in Berlin, but she didn't have any type of painting any type of training in painting or sculpture or writing, nothing like that. It was kind of just things that she picked up from, I think, the circle of people she was with.
But she did engage in all these different art forms. I saw one of her paintings that's at the Museum of Modern Art in New York.
So she did do some painting, but I think that was very early on. She kind of moved away from it, and we see mainly what she's known for is her performance and her ready-mades or assemblage. Speaking more on her performance, I was quoting how she was known around the neighborhood because basically she would just collect all of these random items and make them into these just eccentric, over-the-top costumes. At one point, she actually hooked a bird in a cage to her skirt. So she liked the idea of mixing living things and also non-living materials. Some of her stuff was very lewd. I was trying to find the exact source, but there's a story that at one point she was walking down a main avenue waving wooden dildos. This lady was arrested many times to the point that she...
That sounds like Crew de Vue, not to me.
Yeah, it sounds like Crew de Vue, right? Maybe she was a precursor to Crew de Vue that we didn't know about. But she was, on many accounts say, she was arrested so many times that she actually taught herself how to jump out of the moving police wagon. And the police basically just started letting her go, I think out of a mixture of admiration and amusement, maybe also a little bit of fear. Because I feel like even today, this lady would probably be seen as, a little out there, a little crazy. But again, this is 1913 to I think she stayed in New York till about 1921. Definitely not the behavior of a lady at that time. So I think she definitely scared off some people.
Well, did she ever find or ever want a patron or patroness to support her efforts?
She never found one. I can tell you that. She never found one. I also think it was an odd mix of she wanted some acceptance, but she was so fiercely independent that I don't think she ever, even if she, for some reason, some way, found someone to be a patron, I think it would have been really hard for her to adapt to that lifestyle. Because say if this patron started dictating what she could or couldn't do, I don't think she would have been able to work that way.
She did seem to be promoted by, I found one publication called The Little Review.
She was often written about in The Little Review. I actually think that's the one quote on her that's probably my favorite quote. Here. A writer, Jane Heap, with The Little Review, yes, co-editor, in 1922 described her as the first American Dada. She is the only one living anywhere who dresses Dada, loves Dada, lives Dada. which is going back to what I was saying. These people did not view Dada as just art that they made. It was their life. And when I say, yeah, dresses Dada, like I was saying, her autocentric costumes, Liv's Dada, she would burst into operas. There was a famous French opera singer that she crashed her performance banging spoons on a coal bucket. She crashed a gallery exposition somewhere in New York and just went around and made every painting crooked. Just things like that. And that's what I mean, like they were rebelling, and specifically she was rebelling against the art institution, the fine arts. But again, at the same time, she was mad at America for not having the sophisticated culture. So she's such an interesting character to study because she seems to change her attitude about these things constantly. She wants the old world, but she's rebelling against the old world.
Her performances, were these street performances or were there cabarets in which she performed?
Pretty much only on the street, and that's why it's really hard to find documentation because she wasn't going to a specific space to perform. She was just walking around town, and at the time, people didn't have portable cameras or camera phones like we have now, so there's not really any documentation of that type of stuff. The one performance I spoke about with Man Ray is probably her most famous one as far as a set performance that she actually performed for a camera. And it was the Baroness shaving her pubic hairs. And it was this was in 1921, and it was what is announced the end of American Dada. They all were done with it. They were sick of New York, and they all went their separate ways. And that was how they announced it.
And this was filmed, and do we still have that film?
I believe the film is still out there. I've tried to find a copy of the film. All I've been able to find are stills. So I do have a picture of one of the stills in here. But I also did want to talk about her relationship with Marcel Duchamp, because you were talking about some of the other pioneers in American art, in American Dada at this time. And so the Baroness arrived in New York in 1913. Marcel Duchamp arrived in 1915. And almost immediately they struck up a close relationship. The Baroness, by accounts of many men at this time, was very sexually aggressive. She pursued men relentlessly, even after they made it abundantly clear they were not interested. And Marcel Duchamp was one of those men. She had strong feelings for him, which he did not have for her. However, he really appreciated her as an artist, so they did maintain for quite some time a close working relationship. Duchamp really appreciated just her unbridled creativity. I think he respected her commitment to Dada, not just as an art, but as a lifestyle. And I think really that accumulates in the creation of two art pieces, God and Fountain. Fountain, I would say, is probably the most well-known Dada piece. It's the urinal. It's signed R. Mutt. It's now in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and so is God. So they're actually shown in the museum together. So God is attributed to the Baroness. However, the Philadelphia Museum has it wrongly attributed to some man. I don't even know his name, but they think that likely he's just the guy that photographed it. And Fountain is attributed to Marcel Duchamp. However, there's strong evidence to support that the Baroness at least had a hand in influencing it, if not actually, I say creating it. No one actually created it. It's just a urinal that someone wrote R. Mutt on herself. That's backed in part by Marcel Duchamp. So God was first presented in 1918. Fountain was actually presented the year before in 1917. And in the spring of 1917, Marcel Duchamp wrote a letter to his sister detailing a close female friend of mine under the pseudonym Richard Mutt submitted a porcelain urinal for a show. So that could be evidence number one, our mutt. We also know if you were to stylize it as mutt, r, so mutter, it's mutter, like the German word for mother.
Yeah.
And it's been kind of hinted at that the Baroness was considered the mother of Dada. And if Duchamp was following that thought, maybe that could be it. And also we know that they had a close working relationship. Even I think at the time Duchamp was traveling to other parts of America, but even when he wasn't in New York, they were writing letters back and forth. So it's likely that she could have, again, at least in part, influenced this piece of art, which is, now heralded as the Dada art piece. And this lady's name is hardly even known.
There seemed to be a focus on American plumbing in this movement. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so specifically in American Dada, because it was almost exclusively European expats that made up the American Dada movement. And it is synonymously called American Dada and New York Dada because it pretty much only was happening in New York. So it's the same movement. Coming from Europe, a lot of these people did not experience modern plumbing. And they already were fascinated with American machinery, American skyscrapers. We'll see in some of the men, they have lots of either paintings or assemblages of just skyscraper. Man Ray especially took lots of photographs of different skyscrapers. So they were very interested in this kind of American manufacturing and technology and building. And part of that was also plumbing. And I'm happy you brought that up because also I wanted to talk about with the two pieces, God and Fountain, they also go back to the kind of iconoclasm of Dada in that God is sacrilegious, it's titled God, however, it's just a plumbing pipe. And so she, by titling that, she's relating God to the just banal act of using the bathroom. And then Fountain is nicknamed Madonna of the bathroom. So it's the same thing. So this very kind of sardonic sense of humor, kind of, for lack of a better term, in your face, rebelling against another institute, the Institute of Religion. And yeah, it is really funny that they do have this fascination with plumbing. Because I think you see it in other works, I'm trying to remember which, but these are not the only two works, they're just the two that I think are best comparable. But yeah, that was part of it.
And yet, when I'm thinking about endogenous and androgynous expressions within Dada, for instance, and I'm thinking it in relationship to some other intellectual movements that are taking place in Europe, especially in Austria and in Germany, but starting to impact the United States, certainly by the early 20th century. I'm thinking of things like the psychoanalytic movement vis-a-vis Freud coming out of Austria. I'm thinking of Carl Maria von Kurtenby, who is the person who invented the term homosexualistaten, which we translate homosexuality, advocating that this was actually a form of actual orientation, sexual orientation, probably the first one to do so, to make that connection. These sorts of things had to be impacting, these ideas had to be impacting the art community, especially in Europe, but then by the early 20th century in America as well, I would think.
So I know definitely Duchamp was inspired by Freud. So his female alter ego is Rose C'est-La-Vie, like C'est-La-Vie. The Baroness also did cross-dress, but she never had a specific name, unless she may be Richard Nutt, but that's not confirmed. I think it's safe to assume that yes, the Baroness was also aware of these writings, but at least I have not been able to find any clear evidence of her directly relating it to what she's doing. I'm sure it was maybe in the back of her mind. I think, though, in her case, it was just so much more about rebelling against societal norms and almost the shock factor of it. And especially also being, again, I won't say only, but one of the few women in this type of movement at the time. And again, one of the few women in modern art. Art is still such a male-dominated field that I think she was kind of toying with the notion of, oh, this is a male-dominated movement, a male-dominated field. Okay, I can be a man.
Isn't art still primarily male-dominated? I mean, I struggle to think about female artists, and there are a few that come to mind, but very few in relationship to all the men that come to mind.
I think what would be more correct to say is that art history is male-dominated and male-centric than art is, because there are so many female artists out there, or women-identifying artists, that you just don't know about because they never got the attention, simply because they were not a man. And that's actually a lot of what I focused on while I was still in school. Is I tried as much as I could, as much as it fit into my courses, writing, presenting about either women or women-identifying artists, because it's like you said, it's still a problem with the field today.
Yeah, and there's still ways that you might find that this movement actually, it just occurred to me as we were talking about Crew de Vous, but I'm sure there's other ways in which this movement has continued to have an impact on art both in Europe and America. Am I correct in that?
I would say the strongest one, again, would be conceptual art, just because I think and of course other movements, but I think the strongest thing that Dada imposed on other movements was the whole notion of what is art. Art does not need to be commercial. It does not need to be a fine painting that you like and you buy and hang it on your wall. I know Dada was, I think, one of the pioneers in that thinking of art. It was not a thing to be bought and sold. And I think conceptual art would be the strongest one as far as more contemporary movements to relate it to today. And I did just want to go back on another note when we were just talking about women artists and women in art. The Baroness really didn't even start to be researched until the feminist art movement in the kind of 70s, 80s, like late 60s through the 70s. So she is still pretty unknown today, but she was almost completely unknown for almost 4 or 5 decades. But it took basically other women coming to prominence in this field to go back and see some of the other pioneers of this, she being one of them.